Hello, everybody. Today is my first podcast on my Substack. So, thanks for joining. Either good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is, or whatever time it is, and wherever you are, thank you for stopping by to the local historian. Now, if you've gone onto my page for any length of time and you've read my About page or gotten articles from me before, you know that I don't post often. I post long forms, at least I try to, about once a month. With my master's program kind of starting to come to an end, I'm able to start doing that again. And that is the general format that I want to do. One long article once a month. It gives me enough time to research and do everything that I need to do. But in between those long forms, I want to post short videos, either audio podcasts or visual podcasts, just discussing what I'm reading, what I'm writing, and kind of just any thoughts that I have or conversations with people that I've had. So for today's first video or podcast, audio, I guess, I want to talk about something that I'll be writing about in the near future, not what's going to be posted hopefully tomorrow, but maybe 1 or 2 months down the road. I don't know my exact schedule yet. I haven't, written a hard, concrete what I'm writing, what I'm posting. I just have a few things I'm working on. So the one I want to talk about today is based off of a book I just finished reading. And that book is called A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. And if you know anything about me or what those things might, vaguely kind of represent, you instantly know what it's talking about. A hobbit is J.R.R. Tolkien, a wardrobe is C.S. Lewis, and a great war is what is normally known as World War One. And if you know anything about those two men in that war, you know that they both fought in it. They both were reluctant. They didn't automatically join like many of their peers, but they were drafted towards the end of the war once drafting started. And unlike many of their friends, they survived. And then that is when they started their academic careers at Oxford and Cambridge and their writing careers, where J.R. Tolkien would go on to write The Hobbit. And then after World War II, he would publish The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, the three trilogy. C.S. Lewis would go on to write things such as the Narnia series. He also wrote his science fiction. I always forget the name of the whole series, but he wrote it's called like Out of the Silent Planets, the first book, and I don't remember all the rest. But he wrote other things. Then, of course, once he became a Christian, after a discussion with J.R. Tolkien and some other friends over a long period of time, he would write many theological discussions, kind of combating his how he used to be an atheist and was now a theist. But today, I want to narrow on one aspect of this book. When you read my review, which will be a very good review, I absolutely love the book. But there's one aspect that he did very well. And as he describes World War One and its impact on these two men and really society, the Western world and the world in total, he does a good job of showing the absolute despair that these wars produced. We don't really think about it today. War is kind of removed from us. We've had multiple wars within the last 20 years, within most of my lifetime, but you never heard about it on the news. You never saw videos. You never just saw really anything. It was kind of over there. It was away from us. We still went to Walmart. We still had all of our stuff, and there hasn't been a draft in the 70s was the last time the draft happened during the Vietnam War. So that was 50 years ago. An entire generation, 2 generations have gone by without ever having a draft. And what this author does, and his last name is LeConte, if I'm saying it correctly, what he does is that he paints a picture to explain later the reason why most authors after World War One were so distraught. They had become very, I don't know if it's the exact correct word, but very full of ennui and just very full of melancholy and just despair, and they didn't see what the point of life was. And this would be the start, in some cases, of the modern kind of anti everything. It was anti democracy, anti capitalism, anti religion, anti optimism. This was the end of the optimistic modernist world and the beginning of what we now call postmodernism. This is when that began. And a lot of that stems from one particular thing, what I want to talk about for the rest of this video, and that is trench warfare. And if you remember anything from your high school or college history books, you probably didn't learn much about trench warfare. As if you know me personally or know my writing, I am a graduate student in history. That is what my degree is going to be. I'll be graduating in October. And so I read a lot of history. Primarily, I focus on Germanic history. And one thing I try and do while I focus on ancient Germanic history is tie that to modern times. So I still read a considerable amount of modern history. And one area I have grown to become fascinated with is World War One. How the world could enter such a devastating war and just all the things leading up to it, during it, after it. World War One is horrific and fascinating. So I want to read 4 history books, and then I want to read a section from LeConte's book. And the 4 books, while it sounds like a lot, it's actually just a paragraph really from each one. The first 2 are 2 U.S. history books.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Each one. The first 2 are 2 U.S. history books that I have found when I am doing my old man antique shopping. I'm in my 30s, but you may not know it if you see me at an antique shop. And I love old books. So one of them, it doesn't have a publishing date. Neither of them do, but they're written by the same guy, Thompson. So I'm assuming they're close to be about the same age. And the only thing I can see for the first book to get its age is the fact that the last president is Herbert Hoover. And it says 1929 and then just a dash. So I'm assuming it either was published after he was elected or was somewhere within his presidency. So this doesn't even get into discussing the Great Depression because probably it hadn't really played out enough for them to even write about. The second one, the only thing I can see is that all 50 states are on the map. So that might put it somewhere in the 50s. I'm not sure. And then the second 2 books were written within the last 10 or 20 years. So to read the first book, again, these are pretty short. The title of this section, because the way they have this book was broken up, is they would usually have a bolded title and then 1 or 2 paragraphs and then another bolded title, and it's very broken up. It's for middle high schoolers, so it's very formulaic. So this title is The Armies in Western Europe Deadlocked. And it says, soon after the First Battle of the Marne, the armies on the Western Front settled down to trench warfare. They dug a series of deep trenches from Switzerland through France and Belgium to the North Sea, a distance of 600 miles, and in them the soldiers held their lines. For 4 years, each army tried to assault the force of the other to leave the trenches. These assaults brought on battles that often lasted for months, but no decided advantage came to either side. And that's it. That's the only discussion of trench warfare. The other book, which is again, same author, same series, but a little bit newer. He adds a little bit more by the time they had gotten to this part. And he says, the Western Front. Belgium's small army fought so stubbornly that time was given the French and British armies to come up. The German army, still the strongest in men, guns, and ammunition, forced the Allies, it's a weird book, forced the Allies, as those fighting against Germany came to be called, far into France, When, however, the Marne was reached at a point very near Paris, the Allies, under the French general Joseph J. de Joffre, turned upon the invaders and drove them back into Belgium and northern France. And this is when it starts talking about trench warfare. The opposing armies on the Western Front dug deep trenches running 600 miles from Switzerland through France and Belgium to the North Sea. For 3 years and more, the armies vainly tried by assaults to drive each other from the trenches. The assaults often lasted for months, the loss of men reaching hundreds of thousands. The heroic stand of the Belgians at Yssir, the British at Ypres, and the French at Verdun will forever be emblazoned on the pages of history. So at least this time it talks about how many men died in trench warfare, hundreds of thousands, which is a drastic understatement, but it's a short history book. The next one is actually a history of Germany that I have, starting from the ancient period all the way up to the modern period. And let's see if I can find when this was. 2004 is when this was copyrighted. So this one's 21 years old. And this one has a very short paragraph, again, that just talks about trench warfare. So it says, the war remained close for 3 of its 4 years, due largely to the slow pace of trench warfare, into which the combatants settled within a month of its launch. In September 1914, both sides had dug in along the River Marne, where French and British forces made their stand. Beyond that boundary, the war against France never penetrated. In succeeding years, its pace picked up with the advent of tanks, unrestricted submarine warfare, and the arrival of the Americans. By then, its romance and glory had died a frightful death amid barbed wire, machine guns, and mustard gas. So at least in this book, we discuss, in just one sentence, some of the devastating things that were used in trench warfare. Mustard gas, barbed wire, machine guns, talks about tanks, submarine warfare. So still almost no information, but at least a little more than before. And lastly, you're probably tired of this, but I'm going to discuss the very last book, and then we'll get into the meat and be done with my podcast. So, in this next book, it's called The History of the World by Alex Wolff. And this one I picked up at Books A Million a few years ago. This one came out in 2021. So this one's only 4 years old. So maybe it will give us the most information. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Both sides quickly realized that only way of holding a defensive line against modern machine guns and artillery was to dig trenches. By winter 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the Belgian coast. The Western Front barely moved for the next 3.5 years. Attempts to break the deadlock with new weapons such as poison gas and flamethrowers and tactics like tunneling beneath opposing trenches to blow them up had little impact. In 1916, both sides launched major offensive. In the Battle of Verdun, France eventually managed to resist German attempts to capture the city, but at terrible cost and casualties on both sides. The British led an offensive at the Somme in July. By September, the Allies had advanced around 11 kilometers, which is about 7 miles, at a cost of 600,000 lives. The Germans lost a similar number. So as you can see, based off of these 4 books ranging over 100 years, when it comes to discussing trench warfare, it is just woefully lacking. If you were to just read these types of books, which are just general history books, which aren't wrong, they're not incorrect, they're not factually incorrect, you would walk away thinking that trench warfare was not terrible, that it was warfare, therefore it was bad. No, there's no good kind of warfare. But maybe it wasn't any worse than other types of warfare. And that is just so far from the truth that anyone who knows what it's like, which of course I do not, since I'm in my 30s again, not 100 and something years old, but I've read enough, especially from this book, that you would just chuckle considerably because it is so woefully lacking. And so let me read the couple paragraphs that LeConte has, discussing just the absolute horrific conditions that these soldiers fought in and lived in during World War I, doing trench warfare. So he begins. So he talks about this person named Gilson. He says, what Gilson described was the defining iconic symbol of the war, the trench. For the typical British soldier, life in these elaborate ditches was a quagmire of cold, wet, rat-infested squalor. The trenches were deep enough to shelter a soldier and narrow enough to avoid direct hits from artillery fire. Every few yards, a trench zigzagged to limit the damage from mortar or machine gun attacks. Trench walls, supported by sandbags, were in a constant state of decay. Trench floors, even if covered with wooden duckboards, filled up with water during heavy rains. And 2.5 miles of trench, which I waded yesterday, wrote Wilfred Owen to his mother, there was not 1 inch of dry ground. Rats roamed about at will, gorging themselves on human remains. Some were the size of a cat. Disgusted and harassed by them, soldiers would shoot them, bayonet them, or club them.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Harassed by them, soldiers would shoot them, bayonet them, or club them to death. We burrowed a large cat and shut it up at night to exterminate them, and found the place empty next morning, recorded a soldier in his diary. The rats must have eaten it up, bones, fur, and all, and dragged it to their holes. As bad as the water, mud, rats, roaches, and lice was the smell. The stench of decaying flesh, human and animal, seemed to cover everything. Snipers, grenades, random shell fire, untreated wounds, disease, any number of causes made death, the smell of death a constant presence for soldiers on the front line, writes historian John Keegan. You could smell the front line miles before you could see it. The trenches provided the setting for much of the suffering and lethality of the war. They formed a base of operations for each side's military, offering a measure of protection for soldiers and creating a demarcation line beyond which the heavy guns were nested. Millions of men for months occupied almost unchanging positions within close range of the enemy, explains historian Max Hastings. Rigorous discipline became necessary to avoid exposing even an inch of flesh. During an assault, shells of death flew overhead in both directions, eventually finding their mark. It exploded and a cloud of black reek went up, wrote a British captain during an assault on a trench line. The explosion, he explained, threw up the earth and buried 2 or more soldiers alive. You dug furiously. At least you get them out. 3 dead, gray muddy masses, and 1 more jabbing live one. Then another shell falls and more are buried. And I'll end there. As you can see, or hear, based off of that brief description, which is the same length as all 4 of the other books combined, trench warfare was not only very physically dangerous, as you heard, there's shells from artillery, grenades, people trying to invade back and forth. They would storm through no man's land, and you would just suddenly have someone trying to shoot at you. You had flamethrowers, tanks would roll by, planes. One thing not mentioned by any of these, something I've read or heard a long time ago, was this is when shotguns were invented. So that way when you drop down into a trench, the blast, you don't have to aim. So you have shotguns. If none of that is dangerous enough, you have disease, rats, and the mud. We don't think about how bad just mud is. There was something at that time called trench foot, and that's because your boots were wet forever. So your feet were wet, and so they rubbed together for so long that your skin just started to come off, and it was absolutely horrific. So there was just tons of physical dangers, but we don't even think about the psychological dangers. Being afraid of all of that at all times is just psychologically and mentally devastating. And so reading things like that just expand your knowledge of what reality was for these people. These are our, he talks about that he had relatives that went through this war. J.R. Tolkien is my favorite author in just in anything. He's just my favorite author, period. And knowing what he went through, and the point of this book, helps unlock some of the characters and comments that you read through during the Lord of the Rings. When he's talking about terror of the battle line, he's talking about terror from the ring or from just enemies. He knows from personal experience. He lived through what is still considered the worst war in human history. Not because of lives, that would be World War II, more people died, but the terror of living in the trenches far out exceeded what soldiers went through in World War II. And this is not to, become a comparison of, hey, I lived through something worse, but World War One is considered one of the, if not the worst war in human history. And these men lived through it and survived, and they had to cope with that in some way. These men wrote heroic stories comparing evil and goodness, and they did not do it in a simplistic way. Tolkien's characters are very complex, and you can just see once you realize what World War One was like, you can see behind the veil into the almost therapy that these books were. And the trench warfare, when you just read from generic history books, which aren't bad, there's nothing wrong with just reading a overview. Most history books are kind of like the summary of world history, hitting the highlights, whatever someone thinks are the highlights. It's a whole other conversation. But when you take the time to actually dig deeper into specific periods, which you could read 100 books on World War One and still learn new things, just like any event in human history, you really just see how different it was and what these people really went through. So that is all I have on my first video. It's a little bit longer than I meant. I want to keep them between 10 and 15 minutes, but I had a lot of things I wanted to read to kind of get at the meat of what I wanted to get to. I hope you found this interesting. If you came upon this podcast via YouTube or something else and you are not subscribed, please do so. It helps me out a lot, as I'm sure you've heard a million times. If not, like, share. If you don't want to do any of that, then thank you for just stopping by. I appreciate it. And you all have a blessed rest of your day or evening. Thanks.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.